In the heart of ancient Egypt, behind thick stone walls that shut out the desert sun, a young man sat in the darkness of a prison cell. His crime: refusing to betray his principles. His punishment: years stolen from his life, locked away from the world he had never harmed. Yet in that darkness, something remarkable was taking shape. A story so profound, so filled with divine wisdom, that Allah himself would call it the best of all stories. This is the journey of Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, from the depths of an unjust prison to the heights of power in one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever known. The story of Prophet Yusuf holds a special place in the Islamic tradition. Unlike other prophetic narratives that appear scattered across various chapters of the Quran, Yusuf's complete life story unfolds in a single, uninterrupted chapter. Surah Yusuf stands as a literary and spiritual masterpiece, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, during one of the darkest periods of his mission. It came as divine comfort during the year of sorrow, when he had lost both his beloved wife Khadijah and his protective uncle Abu Talib. When rejection and persecution surrounded him, Allah sent down this story to remind him that hardship is often the pathway to triumph, that patience bears fruit, and that what seems like defeat can be the beginning of victory. The beauty of this story lies not merely in its narrative arc, but in the layers of meaning it carries for every believer who faces trials. It speaks to the slave and the free person, to the prisoner and the powerful, to those who have been betrayed and those seeking to forgive. It reminds us that our circumstances, no matter how dire, are never beyond Allah's control or concern. When we feel trapped by walls we didn't build and locked in situations we didn't choose, the story of Yusuf whispers to our hearts that liberation is possible, that justice will prevail, and that Allah's plans are always unfolding, even when we cannot see them. Before we enter the prison where our story truly begins, we must understand how Yusuf arrived there. He had been the beloved son of Prophet Yaqub, peace be upon him, a boy so beautiful and pure of character that his father couldn't bear to be separated from him. His jealous brothers had thrown him into a well, selling him into slavery for a handful of silver coins. He had been purchased by the Aziz of Egypt, a high-ranking minister, and raised in his household. As he grew into a young man of extraordinary beauty and noble character, the minister's wife, Zuleikha, became obsessed with him. She tried repeatedly to seduce him, using every tool at her disposal, but Yusuf remained steadfast, choosing Allah's pleasure over momentary desire. Let us enter the prison where Yusuf found himself. Imagine the weight of those chains, the cold of the stone floor, the stale air that barely moved through narrow windows set high in thick walls. This was no ordinary imprisonment. Yusuf had committed no crime worthy of punishment. His only offense had been his unwavering commitment to moral purity, his refusal to betray the trust placed in him, and his determination to preserve his integrity even when it would have been so easy to compromise. The wife of the Aziz, the high official who had once taken Yusuf into his home, had tried repeatedly to seduce him. When her efforts failed, when this young man chose the pleasure of Allah over the temporary pleasure of sin, she had turned her frustration into a weapon. The story of how she had invited the noble women of Egypt to her home, given them fruit and knives, then called Yusuf before them, was already well known throughout the city. The women had been so struck by his beauty that they cut their own hands instead of the fruit, declaring he must be a noble angel rather than a human being. But even after this public spectacle, even after Zuleikha's obsession became the gossip of the entire city, the situation only grew worse for Yusuf. He had made his choice clear. In words preserved forever in the Quran, he had said that prison was more beloved to him than what these women were inviting him toward. He had prayed to Allah, acknowledging his human vulnerability, recognizing that without divine protection, even the strongest soul might falter. He had asked his Lord to turn away their plots from him, to save him from falling into the ignorance of sin. And Allah had answered that prayer, but in a way that tested Yusuf's faith and patience to their very depths. So they imprisoned him, not because justice demanded it, but because the truth he represented was inconvenient. The elite of Egypt, seeing how the scandal was spreading, Seeing how the women of the city were gossiping about the minister's wife and her obsession with this slave, decided that the easiest solution was to remove Yusuf from sight. If he was in prison, people would forget. If he was locked away, perhaps the rumors would die down. Even the Aziz himself, who had raised Yusuf and knew his character, agreed to this solution. Perhaps he was trying to protect his wife's reputation, or perhaps he simply wanted the whole embarrassing situation to disappear. The word of the powerful was enough, and Yusuf, despite his innocence, despite the tears in the fabric of his shirt proving he had been running away rather than advancing, found himself condemned. The prison became his home. Scholars tell us he remained there for 7 years, though some say it stretched to 9 or even 12. Different narrations give different lengths, but all agree on one thing. It was a substantial portion of his youth. These were years that most young men spend building their lives, establishing their futures, enjoying their freedom, perhaps starting families. Yusuf spent them in darkness, in confinement, in circumstances that would break many spirits. He was likely in his early 20s when he entered that prison, the prime of life, the years when energy and hope run highest. And those precious years were stolen from him, day by day, month by month, year after year. Yet this is where the true measure of his character began to shine with a brilliance that prison walls could not contain. Prison did not embitter him. Injustice did not make him cynical. The betrayal of those who should have protected him did not turn his heart cold. Being forgotten by a society that should have remembered his innocence did not fill him with rage or despair. Instead, Yusuf did something remarkable. He transformed that prison. He made it a place of learning, of spiritual growth, of service to others. The other prisoners, many of them hardened by life and circumstance, found in him something they had perhaps never encountered before. Here was a man who spoke with genuine concern for their welfare. Here was someone who listened to their troubles, who offered them guidance, who taught them about the one God who sees all and knows all. He preached to them about Tawheed, about the oneness of Allah, about the futility of worshiping created things when the Creator is present and near. He explained to them the religion of his forefathers, Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub, all prophets who had called people to worship Allah alone without partners. Think about what this means. Yusuf could have spent his prison years consumed by thoughts of injustice, replaying in his mind all the wrongs done to him, nursing his grievances, planning revenge for when he was finally freed. No one would have blamed him for spending those years simply trying to survive, keeping his head down, serving his time. But that wasn't Yusuf's way. He understood something profound about adversity that many of us miss. He understood that your circumstances do not have to define your character. That being treated unjustly does not give you permission to become unjust. That suffering, while painful, can become a crucible that purifies rather than destroys. That every moment is an opportunity to worship Allah and serve His creation, regardless of where you find yourself. The prison could confine his body, but his spirit remained free, his purpose remained clear, and his connection to Allah remained unbroken. In fact, it may have deepened. Away from the distractions of the world, away from the temptations of comfort and status, Yusuf had time to immerse himself in prayer and contemplation. He had time to strengthen his relationship with his Creator. The isolation that breaks many people became for him an opportunity for spiritual elevation. He also maintained his physical appearance and dignity as much as possible within the prison's constraints. Reports suggest that even in confinement, he carried himself with a nobility that commanded respect. The guards and fellow prisoners could see that this was no ordinary criminal. There was something different about him, a light that shone through the darkness, a grace that transcended his surroundings. Into this environment came two men whose destinies would become intertwined with Yusuf's in ways they could never have imagined. They were servants of the king of Egypt, men who had once moved in circles of power and witnessed the inner workings of royal authority. One had been the royal cupbearer, the man responsible for serving wine to the king, a position of immense trust since he could easily poison his master if he chose. Every cup the king drank passed through his hands first. The other had been the royal cook, preparing the elaborate meals that sustained the palace, with similar access to harm if he wished. Both had fallen from favor, accused of plotting to poison the king. Whether the accusation was true or false, we don't know with certainty, but the suspicion alone was enough to land them in prison while the matter was investigated. Suddenly, these men who had lived in luxury, who had worn fine clothes and eaten the best food, who had moved through marble halls and served in the presence of royalty, found themselves in a dark cell with chains on their wrists, sharing space with criminals and outcasts. From the moment they encountered Yusuf, they sensed something different about him. It wasn't just his remarkable physical beauty, though that certainly struck them. The reports tell us that Yusuf had been blessed with extraordinary appearance. Some scholars say he was given half of all beauty in creation. When people saw him, they were genuinely startled, as the women who cut their hands had been. But beyond his appearance, there was an aura of piety, a sense of peace and purpose that seemed entirely out of place in a prison. How could someone radiate such tranquility in such circumstances? How could this young man, clearly of noble character, be confined like a common criminal? The questions must have troubled them, but more importantly, they found themselves drawn to him, wanting to know more about who he was and what sustained him. As days passed and they observed Yusuf's conduct, their respect grew deeper. They saw how he treated his fellow prisoners with dignity and compassion. They heard him speak about Allah with such certainty, such intimate knowledge, as if he had direct access to divine wisdom. They witnessed his patience, his lack of complaint, his concern for others even as he endured his own hardships. They noticed that he never spoke ill of those who had wronged him, never gave in to self-pity or despair. These men, who had served in the palace and seen the best and worst of human nature, who had witnessed the corruption and pettiness that often accompanies power, recognized that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. They began to spend time with Yusuf, seeking his company, asking him questions about his beliefs and his life. Yusuf, ever the teacher, ever the guide, used these conversations to share the message of Tawheed with them. He explained that the idols their society worshipped were powerless, that the multiple gods of Egyptian religion were inventions that could neither help nor harm. He taught them about the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth, the source of all power and mercy. He spoke to them with wisdom and gentleness, never mocking their beliefs but inviting them to reason, to think, to recognize the truth. Then came the dreams. On the same night, both men experienced vivid, troubling visions that stayed with them after waking, haunting their thoughts. The cupbearer dreamed that he was back in his former position. He saw himself pressing grapes, squeezing them with his hands to extract wine for the king. In his dream, he saw 3 branches of a vine, and he watched them bud, blossom, and produce clusters of ripe grapes. He took those grapes, pressed them into the king's cup, and placed the cup in the king's hand, just as he had done countless times before his imprisonment. The dream felt so real, so vivid, that when he woke, he could almost feel the grape juice on his hands. The cook had a very different dream, one that filled him with dread. He saw himself carrying bread on his head, 3 baskets of white bread stacked one upon another. In the top basket, there were all kinds of baked goods for the king, delicacies that showcased the cook's skill. But as he carried these baskets, birds began descending from the sky. They swooped down and started eating from the basket on his head, pecking away at the bread meant for the king. He tried to shoo them away, but they kept coming, consuming the food while it rested on his head. The dream left him with a deep sense of unease, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. In ancient Egypt, dreams were taken very seriously. The culture placed immense importance on understanding their meanings, and professional dream interpreters held respected positions in society. The Egyptians believed that dreams could reveal the future, that the gods communicated with humans through nighttime visions, and that understanding these messages could mean a difference between success and disaster. There were books written on dream interpretation, experts who devoted their lives to decoding the symbolic language of sleep. These 2 men knew their dreams meant something, but what? The symbolism eluded them. Yet something told them these visions were significant, perhaps prophetic, certainly not to be ignored. They needed answers, and in that prison, there was one person who seemed to possess knowledge beyond the ordinary. They had heard Yusuf speak with such wisdom about matters of faith and life. They had seen evidence that he had special insight, that he understood things others didn't. If anyone could help them understand these troubling dreams, surely it would be this remarkable young man who had already taught them so much. The two men approached Yusuf with their request. They described their dreams in detail, sharing every element they could remember. The grapes and wine, the bread and birds, the 3 branches and 3 baskets. They asked if he could tell them what these visions meant. The question was posed humbly, respectfully, not as a demand from prisoners who had once held power, but as a genuine plea from men who recognized wisdom when they saw it. Yusuf's response reveals much about his character and his approach to dawah, to calling people to the truth. He didn't immediately launch into dream interpretation. He didn't show off his knowledge or rush to demonstrate his special gift. Instead, he saw an opportunity to address something far more important than their nighttime visions. He saw 2 souls who needed guidance toward their Creator, 2 hearts that were open and searching, 2 men who had been brought into his life at this specific moment for a divine purpose. Yusuf told them he would interpret their dreams, but first, he wanted to share something with them. He wanted to tell them about his Lord, about the God who had granted him this knowledge of dream interpretation, about the futility of worshiping powerless idols when the all-powerful Creator was present and ready to be worshipped. He explained to them that this gift he had, the ability to understand dreams, wasn't magic or fortune-telling. It was knowledge that Allah had taught him, part of the divine favor that had been granted to him and his forefathers. He asked them to consider the logic of their beliefs. What sense did it make to worship many false gods when the one true God existed? Why turn to created things, to statues fashioned by human hands from stone and wood, when the fashioner of all creation was there to be worshipped? He posed it as a question to make them think rather than simply telling them they were wrong. Were there many gods better, or was the one overpowering God better? The answer, when they thought about it honestly, was obvious. He told them about his lineage, about being from the family of Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub, all of whom were prophets who called to the worship of one God without partners. This wasn't something new or strange that Yusuf had invented. It was the original and natural way of relating to the divine, the message that every prophet had brought to every nation throughout human history. The prophets had always said the same thing in different languages to different peoples. Worship Allah alone, and don't associate any partners with him. His approach was gentle but direct, filled with wisdom and compassion. He didn't condemn them harshly for their polytheism or mock their beliefs with scorn. He didn't make them feel stupid or inferior for having grown up with these ideas. Instead, he invited them to think, to reason, to use the intellect Allah had given them. He presented the truth in a way that appealed to both their hearts and their minds, making it easy for them to accept without feeling they were abandoning their culture or betraying their heritage. He showed them that following truth wasn't weakness, but the ultimate strength. He also demonstrated profound humility. He explained that not associating partners with Allah was a mercy from their Lord upon him and his forefathers and upon all people, but he acknowledged that most people were not grateful for this guidance. He didn't present himself as superior to them because of his knowledge. He positioned himself as someone who had been blessed with understanding and wanted to share that blessing with others. The prisoners listened, and something in Yusuf's words resonated with truth in their hearts. Maybe it was the way he spoke, with such sincerity and conviction. Maybe it was the life they had witnessed him living in that prison, seeing his patience and piety day after day. Maybe it was simply that their hearts were ready, that Allah had prepared them to receive this message. Whatever the reason, the truth penetrated their hearts like light breaking through darkness. Here in his prison, in the last place one might expect to find spiritual enlightenment, they encountered the reality of Tawheed. They realized that all their lives they had been worshipping things that had no power, statues that couldn't see or hear, gods that were nothing more than names their forefathers had invented, concepts with no reality behind them. And now they were being offered something real, something that made sense, something that resonated with the deepest intuitions of their souls. They accepted Islam right there in that prison cell. They declared their belief in the one God and rejected the multiple deities they had worshipped before. they became the first Muslims of that prison, guided by a young man who himself was still waiting for justice and freedom. Imagine the joy Yusuf must have felt in that moment. Despite his own suffering, despite years of unjust imprisonment, despite being forgotten by the world outside, he had just helped 2 souls find their way to truth. He had fulfilled the purpose of prophethood, guiding people from darkness to light. Only after securing this greater victory, this transformation of hearts and minds, did Yusuf turn his attention to their dreams. And now that they were believers, now that they understood that his knowledge came from Allah rather than from any magic or trickery, the interpretation would carry even more weight. His interpretation was clear, direct, and detailed. He told the cupbearer that his dream indicated he would soon be released and restored to his former position. Within 3 days, he would once again be serving wine to the king. The 3 branches represented 3 days. The budding, blossoming, and ripening of the grapes represented the quick unfolding of events. Taking the grapes and pressing them into the king's cup represented the return to his original duties. This was good news, a prediction of freedom and rehabilitation, an end to the uncertainty and fear that had plagued him since his arrest. But for the cook, the interpretation brought no comfort. Yusuf told him that within 3 days he would be executed. The king would order him crucified, and his body would be left exposed. Birds would come to eat from his head just as they had eaten the bread in his dream. The 3 baskets represented 3 days, the same time frame as the cupbearer's vision. But where one man's dream promised life and restoration, the others promised death and public humiliation. Imagine the weight of delivering such news. Yusuf could have softened the message, could have been vague or ambiguous, could have said he wasn't sure about the interpretation. He could have simply lied to spare the man's feelings, telling him his dream meant something less terrible. But he was a prophet, and prophets speak truth even when truth is difficult. They don't have the luxury of saying what people want to hear instead of what they need to know. The cook had to face his fate, had to prepare himself for death, had to make peace with his creator in the little time remaining. And Yusuf had to deliver the message Allah had revealed to him through the gift of interpretation. This moment shows us that prophethood isn't always about delivering glad tidings. Sometimes it requires the courage to speak hard truths with compassion. Sometimes it means being the bearer of difficult news while still maintaining kindness and concern for the person receiving that news. Yusuf didn't relish telling the cook about his impending death. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of power from knowing something the other didn't. It was simply his duty to convey what Allah had made known to him. Before the cupbearer left his presence, before their conversation ended, Yusuf made a simple request. He asked the man to remember him when he returned to the king's service, to mention him to the monarch, to let him know that there was an innocent man suffering in prison who had been unjustly accused and forgotten. It wasn't a demand or a plea born of desperation. It was a reasonable request, human in its hope, understandable in its logic. If Yusuf could be brought to the king's attention, perhaps someone in authority would investigate his case. Perhaps justice could finally be served. Perhaps the truth about what had really happened with Zuleikha could come to light. The request was simple. Remember me before your master. Just remember me. Keep me in mind. Don't let my existence fade from memory as you return to your comfortable life. When the opportunity arises, when the moment is right, mention that there was a young man in prison who helped you, who interpreted your dream accurately, who gave you hope when you were frightened and uncertain. Just remember me. The 3 days passed exactly as Yusuf had predicted. The accuracy of his interpretation was proven beyond any doubt. The cupbearer was indeed released from prison, freed from his chains, cleaned up and dressed in proper clothes again. He was brought before the king, given a full pardon, and restored to his previous position of serving wine at the royal table. He walked out of that prison, breathing free air again, seeing sunlight without bars casting shadows across it, returning to a life of comfort and proximity to power. The cool marble of the palace replaced the rough stone of the prison. The fine wine replaced the stale water. The respective courtiers replaced the wariness of fellow inmates. The cook, tragically, met the darker fate Yusuf had foretold. He was brought before the king, found guilty of his alleged crime, and sentenced to death. Within those same 3 days, he was executed by crucifixion, his body left exposed as a warning to others who might consider harming the king. And just as Yusuf had interpreted, the birds came. They descended on the corpse and ate from his head, a grim fulfillment of the dream that had troubled his final days. 2 dreams, 2 accurate interpretations, 2 very different outcomes, but both proving that Yusuf possessed genuine knowledge from Allah. But the cupbearer forgot. In the joy of his liberation, in the relief of escaping punishment, in the rush of resuming his former duties, he forgot about the young man in prison who had given him hope when he needed it most. When he poured wine for the king, he didn't think about Yusuf. When he moved through the palace halls, he didn't remember his promise. When conversations turned to various topics, he never brought up the remarkable prisoner with the gift of interpreting dreams. The Quran tells us that Satan, made him forget. This forgetfulness wasn't merely human error or the natural tendency to move on from unpleasant memories. It was influenced by the whisperings of evil, by the tendency we all have to move on from our troubles without looking back at those still suffering. Some scholars raise an interesting point here about this episode. They note that Yusuf had turned to a human being for help before fully entrusting the matter to Allah. While his request was natural and permissible, there's nothing wrong with asking someone to help advocate for you. It perhaps showed a moment of looking to created means before the Creator. The angel Jibril is reported to have visited Yusuf after the cupbearer left and said to him, "O Yusuf, why did you ask a human for help before asking your Lord? Now you will remain in prison for additional years beyond what might have been necessary." Whether we accept this particular narration or not, the lesson remains powerful and relevant to our own lives. Sometimes Allah allows our deliverance to be delayed, not as punishment, but as a deepening of our reliance upon Him. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually an invitation to a more profound trust. Sometimes we need to learn that every created means of help will ultimately fail us unless Allah wills it to succeed. The cupbearer's forgetfulness wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It became part of Allah's plan, ensuring that when Yusuf's release finally came, it would be in a manner and at a time that would establish him in a position of real authority and respect, not merely as a freed prisoner but as a recognized source of divine wisdom. So Yusuf remained in prison. The months turned into years. The walls that had been his home stayed around him. The routine of prison life continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, with no sign of change on the horizon. The cupbearer served the king, lived his comfortable life, and never thought to mention the remarkable young man who had interpreted his dreams so accurately. It would have been so easy for Yusuf to become bitter during these additional years, to feel betrayed by the cupbearer who had forgotten him, to question Allah's wisdom in allowing his innocence to go unrecognized for so long, to wonder why the interpretation he had given, which proved so accurate, didn't result in his freedom as he had hoped it might. But Yusuf continued to worship. He continued to teach the other prisoners about Tawheed. He continued to pray 5 times a day, to remember Allah morning and evening, to seek his Lord's face with patience and sincerity. He continued to maintain his character, his dignity, his hope. He made that prison a place of divine remembrance, a sanctuary of faith within walls built for punishment. Where others saw only confinement and despair, Yusuf created a mosque, a school, a place where hearts could turn to Allah regardless of the chains on their wrists. The angel Jibril visited him several times during these years of additional waiting, bringing comfort and reassurance from Allah. These visits remind us that Allah never abandons His servants, even when He tests them. When we feel most alone, when our prayers seem to go unanswered, when help doesn't come from the sources we expected, Allah's mercy is still surrounding us. His angels are still near us, and His plan is still unfolding for our ultimate benefit. In one particularly poignant conversation recorded in various narrations, Yusuf asked Jibril about his father, about Prophet Yaqub who had lost him so many years ago when his brothers threw him in the well. Jibril told him that his father sat at home filled with sorrow and grief, that Yaqub had cried so much over the loss of his son that he had lost his eyesight, that his days and nights were spent in worship, prayer, and weeping. That he had never stopped loving Yusuf, never stopped believing he might still be alive somewhere, never stopped making dua for his return. When Yusuf asked why his beloved father had to endure such pain, why a prophet of Allah was suffering such intense grief, Jibril gave an answer that reveals profound spiritual wisdom. He said it was because of Yaqub's excessive love for his son, because his attachment to this created being had become so intense that it needed to be refined through the fire of separation. Allah doesn't like when our love for created beings rivals or exceeds our love for him. He is Al-Ghayr, the one who is protective of his rights, who doesn't share his position in our hearts with anyone or anything else. When we love something in creation more than we love the Creator, that attachment needs to be purified, and Allah, in His mercy, arranges circumstances that help us realign our priorities. But Jibril also shared words of comfort. He told Yusuf that because of this grief, because of this patient suffering in the face of devastating loss, his father was receiving the reward of a martyr every single day. The pain wasn't wasted. The tears weren't meaningless. The separation was serving a divine plan that would ultimately bring blessings to them both. Yaqub's patient endurance of his son's disappearance was elevating his spiritual rank, increasing his reward, and preparing him for an eventual reunion that would be sweeter because of the years of longing that preceded it. Hearing this, Yusuf is reported to have said something beautiful. Then it's not a loss at all. If his father was gaining such reward, if this trial was refining both of them, if Allah was using their separation to deepen their faith and increase their standing in the hereafter, then how could it be called a loss? This perspective, this ability to see divine wisdom even in painful circumstances, characterizes the prophets and those who follow in their footsteps. In the royal palace of Egypt, far from the prison where Yusuf continued his patient vigil, the king was troubled by visions in the night. He had awakened from a dream so vivid, so disturbing, that he could not shake it from his mind even in the clear light of morning. The images replayed in his thoughts as he went through his daily routines, haunting him, demanding interpretation, refusing to be dismissed as mere random images from a restless sleep. He had seen himself standing by the banks of the mighty Nile River, that life-giving waterway that made Egypt's legendary fertility possible. Without the Nile and its annual floods that deposited rich silt on the fields, Egypt would be nothing but desert. The entire civilization depended on that river, and the king, as the ruler of this land, understood its significance better than most. So the setting of his dream by the Nile's banks immediately gave it weight and importance in his mind. In his dream, 7 fat, healthy cows emerged from the river and began grazing peacefully in the lush pasture along the bank. These were magnificent animals, plump and sleek, their coats shining with health, their bodies testament to abundance and good feeding. They represented everything desirable: prosperity, plenty, security. As the king watched them in his dream, he felt a sense of satisfaction at their robust condition. Then came a sight that filled him with inexplicable dread. 7 lean cows, so thin their bones showed through their skin, emerged from the water after the fat ones. These animals looked like death itself, emaciated, weak, pitiful in their scrawny condition. They should not have been able to even walk, let alone what happened next. In a reversal of all natural order, these lean cows began to devour the fat cows. One by one, they consumed the healthy animals entirely, swallowing them whole. And here was the most troubling part of the vision. Even after eating 7 fat cows, even after consuming all that meat in abundance, the lean cows remained just as thin as before. The plenty had been swallowed by scarcity, and nothing remained except the specter of ongoing hunger. The king woke from this dream disturbed, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions about what it might mean. He tried to return to sleep, telling himself it was just a dream, that there was no reason to give it so much importance. Perhaps he had eaten something heavy before bed. Perhaps he had been working too hard, thinking too much about affairs of state. But the troubling images wouldn't leave his mind, and when he finally did drift off again, he had a second vision that seemed to echo and reinforce the first. This time, he saw 7 ears of corn, full and green, swaying gently in the Egyptian breeze. These were perfect specimens of grain, the kind that farmers dream of producing, heavy with kernels, promising excellent yield. They represented successful harvests, full granaries, food security for the nation. Then 7 withered ears appeared, dry and barren, offering nothing of value. And impossibly, against all logic and nature, these dried stalks somehow consumed the green, living ones. The vibrant growth was swallowed up by sterile deadness, and again nothing good remained. When morning came and the king sat on his throne to conduct the business of the day, these dreams were still dominating his thoughts. He couldn't focus properly on the matters being brought before him. He kept seeing those images, the thin cows devouring the fat ones, the withered stalks consuming the green. His counselors noticed his distraction and asked if something was troubling His Majesty. That's when he decided to seek interpretation. He summoned his advisors, his wise men, his court magicians and priests, all those who were supposed to possess knowledge of hidden things and the ability to interpret signs. These were the elite minds of Egypt, trained in the various methods of divination and dream interpretation that Egyptian culture had developed over centuries. Some were priests of the temple, learned in the sacred texts and familiar with the symbolic language used by the gods. Others were professional diviners who specialized in reading meanings from various natural phenomena. All were supposed to be experts in understanding messages from the realm beyond ordinary perception. The king described what he had seen in both dreams, sharing every detail he could remember, holding nothing back. He told them about the cows, fat and lean, and how the thin had devoured the fat. He told them about the grain, green and withered, and how the dry had consumed the fresh. He asked them directly, clearly, "What does this mean? What is being communicated to me through these visions? Should I be concerned? Should I be preparing for something? Give me understanding so I can rule wisely." In the royal palace of Egypt, far from the prison where Yusuf continued his patient vigil, the king was troubled by visions in the night. He had awakened from a dream so vivid, so disturbing, that he could not shake it from his mind even in the clear light of morning. The images replayed in his thoughts as he went through his daily routines, haunting him, demanding interpretation, refusing to be dismissed as mere random images from a restless sleep. He had seen himself standing by the banks of the mighty Nile River, that life-giving waterway that made Egypt's legendary fertility possible. Without the Nile and its annual floods that deposited rich silt on the fields, Egypt would be nothing but desert. The entire civilization depended on that river, and the king, as the ruler of this land, understood its significance better than most. So the setting of his dream by the Nile's banks immediately gave it weight and importance in his mind. In his dream, 7 fat, healthy cows emerged from the river and began grazing peacefully in the lush pasture along the bank. These were magnificent animals, plump and sleek, their coats shining with health, their bodies testament to abundance and good feeding. They represented everything desirable: prosperity, plenty, security. As the king watched them in his dream, he felt a sense of satisfaction at their robust condition. Then came a sight that filled him with inexplicable dread. 7 lean cows, so thin their bones showed through their skin, emerged from the water after the fat ones. These animals looked like death itself, emaciated, weak, pitiful in their scrawny condition. They should not have been able to even walk, let alone what happened next. In a reversal of all natural order, these lean cows began to devour the fat cows. One by one, they consumed the healthy animals entirely, swallowing them whole. And here was the most troubling part of the vision. Even after eating 7 fat cows, even after consuming all that meat in abundance, the lean cows remained just as thin as before. The plenty had been swallowed by scarcity, and nothing remained except the specter of ongoing hunger. The king woke from this dream disturbed, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions about what it might mean. He tried to return to sleep, telling himself it was just a dream, that there was no reason to give it so much importance. Perhaps he had eaten something heavy before bed. Perhaps he had been working too hard, thinking too much about affairs of state. But the troubling images wouldn't leave his mind, and when he finally did drift off again, he had a second vision that seemed to echo and reinforce the first. This time, he saw 7 ears of corn, full and green, swaying gently in the Egyptian breeze. These were perfect specimens of grain, the kind that farmers dream of producing, heavy with kernels, promising excellent yield. They represented successful harvests, full granaries, food security for the nation. Then 7 withered ears appeared, dry and barren, offering nothing of value. And impossibly, against all logic and nature, these dried stalks somehow consumed the green, living ones. The vibrant growth was swallowed up by sterile deadness, and again nothing good remained. When morning came and the king sat on his throne to conduct the business of the day, these dreams were still dominating his thoughts. He couldn't focus properly on the matters being brought before him. He kept seeing those images, the thin cows devouring the fat ones, the withered stalks consuming the green. His counselors noticed his distraction and asked if something was troubling His Majesty. That's when he decided to seek interpretation. He summoned his advisors, his wise men, his court magicians and priests, all those who were supposed to possess knowledge of hidden things and the ability to interpret signs. These were the elite minds of Egypt, trained in the various methods of divination and dream interpretation that Egyptian culture had developed over centuries. Some were priests of the temple, learned in the sacred texts and familiar with the symbolic language used by the gods. Others were professional diviners who specialized in reading meanings from various natural phenomena. All were supposed to be experts in understanding messages from the realm beyond ordinary perception. The king described what he had seen in both dreams, sharing every detail he could remember, holding nothing back. He told them about the cows, fat and lean, and how the thin had devoured the fat. He told them about the grain, green and withered, and how the dry had consumed the fresh. He asked them directly, clearly, "What does this mean? What is being communicated to me through these visions? Should I be concerned? Should I be preparing for something? Give me understanding so I can rule wisely." But they had no answers. To his growing frustration, these supposed experts in dream interpretation dismissed his visions as confused and meaningless. They told him these were alam matathla, confused dreams, jumbles of images with no coherent message, false visions that carry no prophetic significance. Perhaps they truly believed this, or perhaps they simply had no interpretation to offer and sought to protect their reputations by declaring the dreams meaningless rather than admitting their inability to interpret them. Either way, the king was left without answers, troubled by visions he couldn't understand and surrounded by experts who couldn't or wouldn't help him. He must have felt deeply disappointed, perhaps even angry. What was the point of maintaining all these advisors and paying all these priests if they couldn't perform their basic function when he needed them? But more than anger, he felt a growing sense of unease. These dreams felt important. They felt like warnings. And if his experts couldn't help him understand them, then what dark future might be approaching his kingdom without any preparation? This was the moment the cupbearer's memory stirred. As he stood in that court, watching the king's frustration grow, watching the supposedly wise men fail to provide any guidance, something clicked in his mind. A memory from years ago, from that time he preferred not to think about, came flooding back. He suddenly remembered that prison cell, remembered the young man with the unusual gift, remembered how accurately Yusuf had interpreted his dream and the cook's dream all those years earlier. After such a long time, after years of comfortable forgetfulness, the promise he had broken came back to him with the force of divine reminder. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, and addressed the king. He asked permission to speak, to share something that might be helpful in this situation. When the king granted permission, the cupbearer confessed something he had kept hidden for years. He told the king about his time in prison, about the accusation that had led to his imprisonment, about the fear and uncertainty of those days. Then he told him about meeting a young man there who possessed remarkable wisdom and the ability to interpret dreams with perfect, proven accuracy. He described in detail how he and the cook had both dreamed on the same night, how they had shared their dreams with this young Hebrew slave imprisoned there, and how he had interpreted both dreams with complete precision. He explained that Yusuf had told him he would be restored to his position within 3 days, and it had happened exactly as predicted. He explained that Yusuf had told the cook he would be executed within 3 days, and that too had occurred precisely as foretold. Not vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, but specific, clear interpretations that proved entirely accurate in every detail. The cupbearer requested permission to return to the prison and consult with Yusuf about the meaning of the king's troubling dreams. He expressed confidence that if anyone could interpret these visions and provide the king with understanding, it would be this remarkable man who had helped him years ago. The king, desperate for answers and willing to try anything at this point, immediately granted permission. He told the cupbearer to go quickly, to find this interpreter, and to return as soon as possible with whatever understanding could be gained. The cupbearer rushed from the palace to the prison, back to a place he had hoped never to see again. The familiar smell of confinement, the dim lighting, the sounds of chains and suffering, it all came back to him as he entered those gates. But he was here on royal business now, and the guards treated him with respect, quickly leading him to where Yusuf was held. When he found Yusuf, still there after all these years, the cupbearer must have felt a pang of shame. Here was the man who had helped him, whom he had promised to remember, and he had forgotten him for so long, leaving him to languish in unjust imprisonment. But there was no time for lengthy apologies. The king was waiting. The cupbearer presented the king's dreams, describing them in careful detail, just as the king had related them. He told Yusuf about the 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, about how the thin had devoured the fat. He described the 7 green ears of corn and 7 withered ears, and how the dry had consumed the fresh. He explained that the king's own advisors had been unable to interpret these dreams and had dismissed them as confused and meaningless. Yusuf listened carefully to the description of the king's dreams, and immediately the interpretation came to him through divine inspiration, clear and complete. But what Allah revealed to him went far beyond simple explanation. He didn't just see what the dreams meant. He saw what needed to be done about them. He understood both the problem and the solution, both the crisis that was coming and the strategy that would allow Egypt to survive it. This wasn't merely fortune-telling or mystical divination. This was prophetic knowledge combined with practical wisdom, divine revelation working through human intelligence to provide comprehensive guidance. He told the cupbearer that the dreams were not confused at all. They were not meaningless jumbles of images. They were a divine warning about Egypt's immediate future, a message that needed to be understood and acted upon urgently. The 7 fat cows and 7 green ears of corn represented 7 years of agricultural abundance. Egypt would experience exceptional harvests during this period, with the Nile flooding its banks in just the right measure, with rains coming when needed, with crops growing in magnificent plenty throughout the land. These would be years of prosperity, when food would be abundant, and people might be tempted to become wasteful and careless in their consumption. But this abundance, Yusuf explained, was not meant to be consumed carelessly or celebrated thoughtlessly. It was provision for what was coming next. The 7 lean cows and 7 withered ears represented 7 years of severe drought that would follow the years of plenty. During this difficult time, crops would fail almost entirely. The Nile's floods would be insufficient. The rains would not come. The fertile lands would turn barren. People would face genuine starvation if they weren't properly prepared. These would be years of such intense famine that everything stored during the good years would barely be enough to ensure survival. The fact that the lean cows devoured the fat ones but remained thin carried important meaning. It indicated that the consumption during the famine years would be so great that even with preparation, there would be no surplus left over. Every bit of the abundance from the good years would be needed and consumed during the difficult years. Nothing would be wasted, but nothing would remain. The stored grain would sustain life but not create excess. But Yusuf didn't stop there. This is where his interpretation transcended mere fortune-telling and became true prophetic wisdom combined with brilliant economic planning. He outlined a detailed 15-year strategy for national survival, showing not just what was coming but exactly how Egypt should respond to ensure the well-being of its people. He advised that during the 7 years of abundance, the people should sow and harvest as they normally did, continuing their agricultural work with diligence. But instead of consuming everything they produced, instead of celebrating the plenty with feasts and waste, they should practice careful conservation. they should leave most of the grain in its ears, in its natural protective casing. The husk would preserve it better than any storage method humans could devise, protecting it from moisture, pests, and decay. They should consume only what they needed for immediate sustenance, and store everything else against the coming years of scarcity. Then, during the 7 years of famine, they would consume what they had saved from the years of plenty. But even during these hard years, they must maintain discipline and restraint. They should not panic and consume everything at once. They should continue to ration carefully, holding back a little even from their stored reserves, because scarcity makes people desperate and prone to waste in their fear. If they maintained wise management even during the crisis years, the stored abundance would see them through to the other side. And then came the promise of hope that completed the interpretation. Yusuf told them that after these 14 years, 7 of plenty and 7 of scarcity, there would come a year of relief. A year when the rains would return in abundance, when the crops would grow again, when people would be able to press grapes and olives once more, when normal agricultural life would resume it. The crisis would not last forever. If they could maintain patience and discipline through the difficult period, better times awaited them on the other side. This was far more than dream interpretation. This was a comprehensive 15-year strategic plan for national survival, covering everything from agricultural policy to storage techniques to consumption patterns to long-term hope. It showed economic foresight, agricultural wisdom, psychological understanding of how people behave during crisis, and practical governance. Yusuf had not only explained what the dreams meant, he had shown exactly how Egypt could navigate the crisis and emerge intact on the other side with its people alive and its society functioning. The cupbearer listened in amazement. The interpretation made perfect sense. It explained every element of the king's dreams and transformed troubling visions into actionable intelligence. He thanked Yusuf profusely and rushed back to the palace to report everything to the king. When he arrived and shared Yusuf's interpretation and recommendations, the king and his entire court were astonished. This was exactly the kind of wisdom they had been seeking. It didn't just explain the dreams. It provided a path forward. Every advisor in the room recognized immediately that this interpretation rang true, that it carried the weight of genuine prophetic knowledge, and that Egypt needed to act on it immediately. The king was deeply impressed, not just by the accuracy and completeness of the interpretation, but by the practical wisdom and foresight it demonstrated. This young man in prison had shown more understanding of governance and economics in one interpretation than most of the king's advisors had shown in years of service. The king immediately wanted to meet this remarkable person, to bring him to the palace, to put his wisdom to use for the benefit of Egypt and its people. The king ordered that Yusuf be brought before him immediately and without delay. Here was a man of obvious wisdom, someone who could provide not just interpretations but solutions, someone who understood both divine signs and practical realities. The king wanted this person at his court, advising him, helping him prepare for what was coming, contributing his remarkable gifts to the governance of the nation. Royal messengers were dispatched to the prison with orders to release Yusuf immediately and escort him to the palace with all due respect. The prison guards removed Yusuf's chains and told him he was free, that the king himself had ordered his release, that he was to come to the palace at once. Can you imagine the emotions that must have surged through Yusuf in that moment? After 7, 9, perhaps even 12 years of unjust imprisonment, he was finally being acknowledged. The gift Allah had given him had finally brought him to the attention of those who could grant him freedom. The interpretation of a dream, just like the interpretation he had given to the 2 prisoners years before, was opening the door to a completely new life. But when the messengers told Yusuf that the king wanted to see him, that he was to be released immediately and brought to the palace, Yusuf did something completely unexpected. He refused to leave. Not out of stubbornness or false pride, not out of fear of the outside world after so long in confinement, but out of a profound understanding of justice and the critical importance of clearing one's name before moving forward. He told the messengers to return to the king with a message. He wanted the king to investigate the incident that had led to his imprisonment before he would agree to leave the prison. Specifically, He wanted the king to question the women who had cut their hands when they saw him at Zuleikha's gathering, and to inquire thoroughly about the woman who had falsely accused him of attempting to assault her. Only after the truth was established, only after his innocence was proven publicly and officially, would he agree to come out. This demand reveals Yusuf's wisdom and his concern for something far more important than mere physical freedom. He could have walked out of that prison immediately, grateful to escape, eager to begin his new life, ready to leave the painful memories behind. Most people in his situation would have done exactly that. Who would blame him for wanting to get out as quickly as possible after years of unjust confinement? Why would he risk antagonizing the king by refusing a direct royal summons? But Yusuf understood something crucial. He understood that leaving under a cloud of suspicion, with people still believing he had attempted to assault his master's wife, would compromise everything he tried to do afterward. His reputation mattered, not for ego's sake or personal pride, but because a man whose character is questioned cannot serve effectively or call people to truth convincingly. If he walked out of prison without clearing his name, people would always wonder about him. They would whisper that maybe the accusations were true after all, that perhaps he was released for his useful gift of interpretation despite being guilty of the original charges. That shadow would follow him forever, undermining his authority and limiting his ability to do good. He wanted everyone to know beyond any doubt that he had not betrayed the trust placed in him. He wanted it established clearly and publicly that he had resisted temptation repeatedly, that he had chosen righteousness even when it led to imprisonment, that his character was above reproach. He wanted the truth about Zuleikha's behavior and her false accusation to be acknowledged openly by the king and the court. Only then, with his innocence proven and his character vindicated before the entire nation, would he emerge from prison. Only then could he serve effectively without the weight of suspicion holding him back. This also shows Yusuf's understanding of the importance of establishing truth for its own sake, not just for personal benefit. He wanted justice, not merely freedom. He wanted the wrong that had been done to him to be acknowledged and corrected, not swept under the carpet of expedience. He was teaching a profound lesson about integrity, that we should care more about truth being established than about our own immediate comfort, that clearing our names when falsely accused is not just personal vanity but a duty we owe to truth itself. The messengers returned to the king with Yusuf's response, and the king was even more impressed. This was not the behavior of a guilty man desperate to escape. This was the behavior of someone who valued truth and justice more than personal freedom. A man who would refuse immediate release in order to ensure proper investigation was clearly someone of remarkable character. The king immediately ordered that the investigation be conducted exactly as Yusuf had requested. He summoned the women of the city, particularly those who had been at Zuleikha's famous gathering, and questioned them about what had happened. He wanted to hear from witnesses, to understand the full story, to establish the truth beyond any reasonable doubt. The women, now confronted directly by royal authority and unable to evade with gossip or partial truths, had to testify honestly about what they had seen and experienced. One by one, the women confessed the truth. They acknowledged that Yusuf had done nothing wrong, that his conduct had been beyond reproach, that he had resisted all temptation consistently. They testified that when Zuleikha had summoned them to her home and given them fruit and knives, then called Yusuf before them, his beauty had been so overwhelming that they had cut their own hands without realizing it. They admitted that they had declared him to be like a noble angel rather than an ordinary human being. They confirmed that the obsession had been Zuleikha's, that Yusuf had been the one fleeing and resisting, and that the entire situation had been caused by the minister's wife's inappropriate passion rather than by any misconduct on Yusuf's part. And then came the moment of ultimate vindication. Zuleikha herself, that woman who had pursued Yusuf so relentlessly, who had caused his imprisonment through her false accusation, who had been the source of all his suffering in Egypt, stood before the king and made a full public confession. She had no choice but to tell the truth when confronted with direct questioning from royal authority and the testimony of other witnesses. She admitted that she had tried to seduce Yusuf repeatedly. She acknowledged that he had refused all her advances consistently and firmly. She confessed that when he rejected her final attempt and fled from the room, she had become angry and falsely accused him of attempting to assault her, leading to his unjust imprisonment. She stated clearly that Yusuf was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. But she also said something remarkable that showed a certain honesty even in her confession. She testified that in all her interactions with him, despite her persistent and shameful attempts to corrupt him, she had never seen a man of such pure character and steadfast integrity. She declared openly that Yusuf had maintained his righteousness throughout every test, and that she alone bore the guilt for what had happened. She made no excuses, offered no justifications for her behavior, simply stated the plain truth that she had been wrong and he had been right. This public confession accomplished everything Yusuf had sought. His innocence was now established beyond any shadow of doubt. The false accusation was revealed as completely false before the king, the court, and eventually all of Egypt. His years in prison were officially recognized as a grave injustice perpetrated against an innocent man. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows into the full light of day, and Yusuf's character stood vindicated before all who had questioned it. Some historical reports suggest that Zuleikha's husband, the former Aziz, divorced her after this public shame and humiliation, unable to continue the marriage after such a scandalous confession before the entire court. Other reports suggest that he never divorced her, but that the grief and embarrassment of his wife's public confession broke him mentally and physically, and he died shortly thereafter from the accumulated stress and shame. Either way, Zuleikha's life as she had known it was completely over. She had lost everything: her husband, her status, her reputation, her comfortable life. The obsession that had driven her to such destructive behavior had cost her dearly, while Yusuf, who had suffered because of her false accusation, was about to see his life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The king sent word again to Yusuf. Now that the investigation was complete, now that his innocence had been proven beyond all doubt, now that everyone knew the truth, he was invited to come to the palace not as a freed prisoner but as an honored guest, as someone whose character had been established and whose wisdom was recognized. The king also made it clear that Zuleikha would face consequences for her false accusation and the injustice she had caused, though Yusuf himself, as we will see, showed remarkable mercy in how he responded to her later. With his innocence fully proven and his character publicly established, Yusuf finally emerged from prison. He was cleaned up, given proper clothing befitting someone about to meet royalty, and escorted to the palace. This was not a humiliating exit as a suspected criminal grudgingly released. This was an honorable departure as a wrongly imprisoned man now vindicated, walking out with his head held high and his reputation restored. The guards who had watched over him knew his innocence. The fellow prisoners who had learned from him knew his righteousness. And now the king himself would learn what kind of man had been suffering unjustly in his kingdom's prison. When Yusuf stood before the king, entering the throne room where power resided and decisions were made, the monarch was deeply impressed by everything he saw. Yes, Yusuf's physical beauty was remarkable. The reports had not exaggerated that aspect. But far more importantly, the king recognized in him a quality that transcended mere appearance. He saw wisdom in Yusuf's eyes, composure in his bearing, intelligence in his speech, and nobility in his character that no amount of imprisonment could diminish. Here was someone special, someone who had endured years of injustice without becoming bitter, someone who had maintained his integrity through every test life had thrown at him. The king engaged Yusuf in conversation, testing his knowledge, exploring his understanding of various matters of state and governance. He asked him about economics, about agriculture, about managing people and resources. He inquired about his background, about how he had learned to interpret dreams, about what sustained him through years of unjust imprisonment. Every answer Yusuf gave demonstrated clear thinking, practical wisdom, genuine concern for people's welfare, and a maturity that belied his relatively young age. The king found himself increasingly amazed that such a person had been languishing in prison, while lesser men held positions of authority in his court. The king made his decision quickly and decisively. He declared publicly before his entire court that Yusuf would hold a position of high rank and trust in his government. He praised Yusuf's character, his wisdom, and his obvious gifts, then essentially offered him a blank check in terms of responsibility. "Tell me what position you want. The king said in effect, "You have proven yourself beyond any doubt through your patience, your integrity, and your wisdom. You will be my honored representative, trusted and empowered with real authority. What role do you wish to fill in my government?" Here again, Yusuf's response showed his unique character and his selfless motivation. He didn't ask for a ceremonial position that would give him status without responsibility. He didn't seek a comfortable role that would allow him to enjoy luxury after years of deprivation. He didn't request authority over people just to experience what it felt like to have power after being powerless for so long. Instead, he asked for the specific responsibility that would allow him to implement the plan he had outlined for surviving the coming crisis. His words, preserved in the Quran, were simple but profound and revealing. He said, "Appoint me over the storehouses of the land. Indeed, I will be a knowing guardian for them." In Arabic, the two words he used to describe himself were hafiz and alim, guardian and knowledgeable. These words encapsulated everything a finance minister or treasury secretary should be. A guardian who protects resources from waste and theft, who ensures they are not spent on undeserving causes or false priorities, who treats public wealth as a sacred trust, and one who is knowledgeable enough to understand when to save and when to spend, neither hoarding unnecessarily nor squandering foolishly, capable of making wise economic decisions for the benefit of the entire nation. Yusuf was telling the king, "I don't want power for its own sake, but I do want the specific responsibility that will allow me to save your people from the starvation I know is coming." The king granted his request immediately and enthusiastically. More than that, some historical reports suggest the king gave Yusuf authority over almost everything except the throne itself. Yusuf became, in effect, the prime minister of Egypt, with control over economic policy, resource management, agricultural planning, and administrative decisions throughout the land. The king gave him the royal signet ring, indicating that any decree Yusuf issued bearing that seal would be considered the king's own command and must be obeyed by everyone in the kingdom. This was an extraordinary level of trust and authority. The king was essentially saying, "I recognize that you understand what needs to be done better than I do, and I'm giving you the power to do it without interference." It showed remarkable wisdom on the king's part, the ability to recognize genuine competence and to empower it, regardless of the person's background as a foreign slave and former prisoner. Some scholars mention that Yusuf was 30 years old when he assumed this position. Consider that journey for a moment. He had been sold into slavery as a child, probably around the age of 12 or 13. He had served in the Aziz's house as a young teenager and young man, perhaps for 7 or 8 years. He had then spent another 7 to 12 years in prison during his 20s. And now, still in the prime of youth, he was being entrusted with governing one of the most powerful and sophisticated nations on earth. There's an important point to understand about Yusuf seeking this position of authority. In Islamic tradition, there's generally a strong discouragement against seeking positions of governmental power. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, advised against asking for offices of authority, teaching that those who actively seek such positions often lack the divine support needed to fulfill them properly and may be driven by ego rather than service. The general principle is that positions of authority should be offered to the qualified rather than sought by the ambitious. But Yusuf's case was different, and scholars throughout Islamic history have explained why his request was not only permissible but actually praiseworthy and necessary. There are several factors that made his situation unique and justified his direct request for this specific position. First, Yusuf knew that no one else had the knowledge and vision to manage the coming crisis effectively. This wasn't arrogance or overconfidence. It was a realistic assessment based on divine revelation. Allah had shown him through the king's dream what was coming and what needed to be done. He had been given prophetic knowledge that no one else possessed. To remain silent when he had crucial information that could save millions of lives would have been a dereliction of his duty as a prophet and as someone concerned for human welfare. Second, his motivation was completely pure and untainted by selfish ambition. He wasn't seeking power for personal gain, recognition, wealth, or status. He wasn't trying to get revenge on those who had wronged him by rising above them in authority. He sought the position specifically and solely to serve Allah's creation, to implement the plan that would save potentially millions of people from starvation. His goal was service, not status. He wanted the responsibility, not the privileges. Third, he had the character and competence needed for the role. He wasn't some unqualified person seeking a position beyond his abilities. He combined moral integrity with practical wisdom, spiritual devotion with administrative capability, patience with decisiveness. He had proven his trustworthiness through years of tests. He had demonstrated his wisdom through his interpretations and counsel. He was perhaps the only person in Egypt who had both the knowledge of what was coming and the character to implement the necessary policies without corruption or deviation. Fourth, he wasn't seeking luxury or ease, but rather a position of immense responsibility and difficulty. Managing a nation's entire food supply and economy through 15 years of dramatic swings between abundance and scarcity would be exhausting, stressful work with little room for error. He was volunteering to shoulder an enormous burden for the sake of others' well-being. This wasn't someone seeking an easy, comfortable position. This was someone accepting a difficult duty. And finally, the circumstances demanded working within the existing system to bring about the greatest good and prevent the greatest harm. Egypt had a king and a governmental structure. Yusuf couldn't simply overthrow the system and install an Islamic state. But he could work within the existing framework to save lives, establish justice as much as possible, and call people to truth through his character and actions. The choice wasn't between serving in this government or serving in a perfectly Islamic one. The choice was between serving in this government and not serving at all. And not serving would mean allowing millions to potentially die in a famine that could be prevented. This is why later Islamic scholars, including some of the great imams, would cite Yusuf's example when allowing righteous people to serve in less than ideal governments under certain circumstances. Imam Musa al-Qadim, for instance, permitted his student Ali ibn Yaqub to serve as prime minister under an Abbasid ruler who was often unjust. The imam understood that having someone of good character in that position could mitigate harm, protect people from worse alternatives, and allow some good to be accomplished even within an imperfect system. So Yusuf accepted the position not with joy at gaining power, but with seriousness at accepting responsibility. The Quran tells us that Allah established him firmly in the land, granting him authority and the ability to reside wherever he wished. But Yusuf didn't use this new authority for self-indulgence. He didn't build palaces for himself or accumulate wealth or surround himself with luxury. Instead, he threw himself immediately into the work of preparing Egypt for the crisis he knew was coming. Yusuf threw himself into his new responsibilities with the same dedication and integrity he had brought to every challenge in his life. The 7 years of abundance had either already begun or were about to begin, and there was absolutely no time to waste. He needed to completely restructure Egypt's agricultural and economic systems to prepare for the unprecedented crisis that would follow. This wasn't just about tweaking existing policies or making minor adjustments. This required a comprehensive transformation of how the nation produced, stored, distributed, and consumed food. His first action was to tour Egypt extensively, seeing the land with his own eyes rather than relying solely on reports from officials. He traveled from the delta in the north, where the Nile spread into multiple branches before entering the Mediterranean, down to the southern regions where the great river brought its life-giving waters from distant mountains. He assessed agricultural capacity in different regions, identifying the areas with the most fertile soil, the best access to irrigation, the highest productivity potential. He met with farmers and landowners, understanding their methods and capacities, learning about local conditions that affected yields. He wasn't managing from a distance like many government officials who make decisions without understanding ground realities. He involved himself directly in understanding the resources he would need to marshal and the challenges he would need to overcome. He walked through fields, inspected irrigation systems, observed planting and harvesting methods, and listened to the people who actually worked the land and understood its rhythms. Based on this comprehensive assessment, he began implementing his plan. He allocated additional funds and resources to farmers in the most productive regions, enabling them to expand their cultivation, to plant more extensively, to maximize yields during these abundant years. He provided seeds, tools, and support to ensure that every piece of arable land was being used to its full potential. He understood that the surplus they could create during these 7 years would literally mean the difference between life and death for millions of people during the 7 years that would follow. He ordered the construction of massive granaries throughout the land, storage facilities capable of holding hundreds of thousands of tons of grain. These weren't hasty structures thrown up carelessly. They were carefully designed with the wisdom of someone who understood both the blessings of abundance and the ravages of scarcity. They were built to preserve food for years, with features that would protect grain from moisture, heat, pests, and decay. Ventilation systems to prevent molding. Elevated floors to keep rodents out. Secure entrances to prevent theft. These granaries represented sophisticated agricultural engineering. Then came the key economic policy that would define his tenure as Egypt's minister. Yusuf established a comprehensive system where during these 7 years of plenty, the government would purchase surplus grain from farmers at fair prices and store it in the royal granaries. He didn't confiscate or steal from the farmers. He paid them properly for their produce, maintaining their trust and ensuring they had incentive to maximize production. But he also made it clear that the nation needed to build reserves, that this abundance wasn't just for immediate consumption but for securing the future. He also made public announcements encouraging every household that had the means to store their own grain to do so. He wanted both centralized storage under government control and distributed storage in homes throughout the land. Multiple strategies working together to ensure survival. Some families had the space and ability to keep reserves in their own homes. He encouraged this. Others didn't have such resources. The government granaries would provide for them when the hard times came. He imposed strict restrictions on the export of grain during these years of plenty. Egypt had long been a breadbasket for surrounding regions, and during years of abundance, it was natural to sell surplus to neighboring lands for profit. Merchants could make fortunes exporting grain to countries willing to pay high prices. But Yusuf understood that every single kernel exported now would be a kernel missing when famine struck. The future hunger of Egypt's own people was more important than present profits from trade. So he closed the borders to grain export, ordering that Egypt's abundance must stay in Egypt, stored against the coming catastrophe. This wasn't a popular policy with merchants and traders who saw opportunities for profit slipping away. But Yusuf had the authority from the king and the moral conviction to enforce it despite the complaints. He knew he would be proven right, and he was willing to be temporarily unpopular in order to save lives later. He also instituted rationing even during the years of plenty. People couldn't simply consume as much as they wanted just because food was abundant. They were given what they needed for healthy sustenance, but no more. The surplus was directed into storage. This must have been extraordinarily challenging to enforce. Imagine trying to convince people to eat less when food is abundant all around them, to save for a disaster they haven't experienced yet and might not believe is really coming, to trust that lean years were approaching when everything they saw spoke of plenty and prosperity. Human nature tends toward consumption when resources are available. We want to enjoy what we have now, to celebrate abundance, to feast when food is plentiful. Telling people they can't do that they must restrain themselves and think about a future crisis, goes against natural inclinations. But Yusuf understood that discipline during good times is what makes survival possible during bad times. He had to teach a whole nation to think long-term, to delay gratification, to trust his vision of what was coming. His position gave him authority to enforce these policies, and his proven character gave him credibility to convince people to accept them. He wasn't hoarding while asking others to sacrifice. He lived simply himself, focused entirely on preparing the nation for what he knew was coming. He wasn't enriching himself or his family. He was working tirelessly for the welfare of people he had no biological or tribal connection to. When leaders show such sincerity and selflessness, people are more willing to follow even difficult policies. The king, trusting Yusuf's wisdom completely, supported these policies publicly even when they seemed extreme to others in the court. Some advisors probably questioned whether all this effort and restriction was really necessary. Maybe the dreams were just dreams after all. Maybe the interpretation was wrong. Maybe they were sacrificing too much present enjoyment for a future crisis that might not materialize. But the king had seen enough of Yusuf's wisdom to trust him, and that royal backing was crucial for such sweeping changes. As the years passed, the granaries filled steadily. Vast stores of grain accumulated throughout Egypt, more than the nation had ever maintained before. The nation had never seen such systematic preparation, such forward-thinking governance, such careful stewardship of resources. Yusuf was implementing economic policies and agricultural strategies that would be studied and admired for millennia afterward. He was showing what it means to be a true steward of resources, to think beyond the moment, to prepare for crises before they arrive, to put the welfare of people above short-term profits or popularity. He maintained detailed records of everything in storage. What was in each granary, when it had been stored, how much remained available, what the consumption rates were. He created a sophisticated system of inventory management that allowed him to know exactly what resources the nation had and how long they would last under different scenarios. This level of administrative competence was remarkable for the time. He also continued his mission of calling people to the worship of one God. His position gave him a platform he had never had before. As the most powerful person in Egypt after the king, as the man who controlled the nation's food supply and economic destiny, people listened when he spoke. He used that influence not to aggrandize himself, but to share the message of Tawheed. He taught those who worked with him about Allah, about prophethood, about the religion of his forefathers. He showed through his character and actions what it meant to be a servant of the one true God. And then, just as Yusuf had predicted years before when he interpreted the king's dream, the 7 years of abundance came to an end. The shifts were gradual at first. The Nile's annual flood, so crucial to Egypt's fertility, was less generous than usual. The waters didn't rise quite as high, didn't deposit as much rich silt on the fields. The rains that typically came at certain seasons were lighter or delayed or didn't come at all. Farmers noticed their crops weren't responding as vigorously as in previous years. Yields began to decline noticeably. In the first year of this transition, there was still some harvest, though it was diminished compared to the abundance of the previous 7 years. But in the years that followed, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Almost nothing grew. Fields that had produced abundantly just months before now yielded almost nothing. The soil, deprived of the Nile's nourishing floods, became hard and unproductive. Seeds that were planted either failed to sprout or produced stunted plants that bore little fruit. The 7 years of drought and famine had arrived, exactly as Yusuf had foretold when he interpreted the king's dream. Egypt began distributing the stored grain according to the system Yusuf had established. Thanks to his meticulous planning and the discipline he had enforced during the years of plenty, there was enough. The people didn't starve. The crisis that could have devastated the nation, that could have led to mass death and social collapse, became manageable because one man had the foresight to prepare and the authority to implement his vision. Families came to the distribution centers and received their rations. The granaries that had seemed excessive during the abundant years now proved to be precisely what was needed. Yusuf set fair prices for the grain, selling it at the pre-famine rates rather than exploiting people's desperation with inflated prices. This showed his character once again. He could have enriched the royal treasury enormously by charging whatever the market would bear during a famine. People would have paid almost anything for food when they were starving. But he saw his role as serving the people, not profiting from their misery. He provided what they needed at prices they could afford, ensuring that even the poorest families could obtain enough to survive. The distribution system was orderly and efficient. Yusuf had planned for this moment during all those years of preparation. He knew how much grain was in each location, how many people needed to be fed in each region, what the daily requirements were. His administrative competence, combined with his moral integrity, meant that the system worked smoothly even under the pressure of a widespread scarcity. But it wasn't just Egypt that faced this catastrophic famine. The drought extended far beyond Egypt's borders. The same lack of rain, the same agricultural failure, struck all the neighboring lands, Canaan, Syria, and the surrounding regions. These areas hadn't received prophetic warning. They hadn't prepared during years of plenty. They hadn't stored reserves or rationed consumption. When the drought came, they faced immediate crisis with no resources to draw upon. These nations had long relied on importing grain from Egypt during difficult years. Egypt's fertility, guaranteed by the Nile even when other regions suffered drought, had made it the breadbasket of the ancient Near East. But now, with Egypt controlling exports tightly and facing its own crisis, they found themselves in desperate circumstances. Their own fields produced nothing, and their traditional source of supplemental grain was close to them. Word began to spread, however, that Egypt had food. Somehow, impossibly, Egypt was still distributing grain even when nothing was growing. Travelers brought back reports of massive granaries filled with stored food, of organized distribution systems, of a government that had somehow prepared for this catastrophe. People couldn't understand how Egypt had known to prepare, but they knew that Egypt had what they desperately needed. Yusuf, while keeping a close watch on the needs of Egypt's own population, made a strategic decision. He would allow limited sales of grain to these neighboring nations, but at significantly higher prices than what Egyptians paid. This served multiple purposes. First, it brought enormous wealth into the royal treasury. Second, during this life and death situation, these neighboring nations became extremely grateful to Egypt and more inclined to maintain peaceful relations with the nation that controlled their access to food. Third, it gave Yusuf political influence over these regions that would prove valuable in the years ahead. The restrictions were carefully calibrated. He would only sell amounts that wouldn't jeopardize Egypt's own food security. He maintained detailed projections of how much Egypt needed for its own population and only released surplus beyond that amount. The high prices also served a practical purpose. They prevented hoarding and ensured that only those who genuinely needed the grain would pay such rates. This was sophisticated economic policy that balanced humanitarian concern with strategic advantage and financial prudence. All of this was a result of Yusuf's unparalleled wisdom, foresight, and administrative capability. He had taken a prophetic warning and transformed it into a comprehensive national strategy that not only saved millions of lives but also elevated Egypt's regional power and influence. Both the king and the common people became deeply impressed by him and openly praised his leadership. Stories of the wise young minister who had saved Egypt from starvation spread throughout the land and beyond its borders. Among the many people suffering from this widespread famine were the family of Prophet Yaqub, peace be upon him, living in the land of Canaan. Yaqub was now an elderly man, still carrying the grief of losing Yusuf all those years ago. He had 10 sons from his first wife, the same brothers who had thrown Yusuf into the well and sold him into slavery. He also had Binyamin, Yusuf's full brother, the only other son from his beloved late wife. Binyamin had been just an infant when Yusuf disappeared, and now he was a young man who had never known his older brother. The famine hit Canaan hard. Their flocks found little to graze on. Their fields produced almost nothing. Their stored food was running out. The family faced genuine hunger. Yaqub's sons heard the same reports that others were hearing, that Egypt had food available for purchase, that there was a wise minister there who was selling grain to foreigners who could pay for it. They came to their father and said they wanted to travel to Egypt to buy provisions for the family. Yaqub agreed this was necessary but made one firm condition. He refused to allow Binyamin to accompany them. He had lost Yusuf years ago under his brother's supervision, and the pain of that loss had never healed. He wasn't going to risk losing Binyamin as well. The 10 older brothers would go, but Binyamin would remain home with his father. The brothers tried to persuade him, arguing that they needed everyone to carry back as much grain as possible, but Yaqub was adamant. Binyamin was not going. So the 10 brothers set out for Egypt, traveling the long journey from Canaan southward. They arrived in Egypt's capital, found their way to the distribution center where foreigners could purchase grain, and waited their turn to be received by the minister who controlled all food sales. When their turn came, they entered the chamber where Yusuf sat conducting business. The moment Yusuf saw them, he recognized his brothers immediately. How could he not? These were the men who had thrown him into a well, who had sold him as a slave, who had caused all his suffering. But they didn't recognize him at all. They saw a powerful Egyptian official, probably in his 30s now, dressed in ministerial robes, speaking Egyptian, wielding immense authority. How could this be their little brother who had disappeared as a teenager more than 20 years ago? The context was so completely different from anything they associated with Yusuf that recognition was impossible. Yusuf felt a flood of emotions. He must have remembered everything. A well, the slave market, Zuleikha's house, the false accusation, the prison, all the suffering that had flowed from their betrayal. But he also remembered his father's teaching, remembered the patience Allah had granted him, remembered that he was a prophet with a mission larger than personal grievances. He decided not to reveal his identity yet. There was wisdom in waiting, in seeing what kind of men they had become, in testing whether they had changed. He questioned them about their background and purpose. They explained they were from Canaan, sons of Prophet Yaqub, and had come to buy grain because of the famine. Yusuf asked if they had other family members. They mentioned their elderly father and a younger brother back home. Yusuf inquired why this younger brother hadn't come with them. They explained that their father wouldn't allow it, that he was especially protective of this youngest son. Yusuf decided to test them. He said that next time they came, they must bring this younger brother, or he wouldn't sell them grain again. He wanted to see Binyamin, his full brother, the only sibling who had no part in what had been done to him. He also secretly ordered his servants to return the money they had paid for the grain, placing it back in their bags without them knowing. This way, they would have no excuse not to return. They couldn't claim they lacked funds for another trip. He treated them hospitably, selling them the grain they needed and arranging for their provisions. But before they left, he made his requirement clear. Bring your younger brother next time, or don't bother returning. He wanted to verify their story, he told them, to confirm they were who they claimed to be and not spies. This gave him a pretext to insist on seeing Binyamin. The brothers returned to Canaan with the grain and reported to their father. They told him about the powerful minister who controlled Egypt's food supply, how he had treated them well, but insisted they bring Binyamin on their next trip. Yaqub was deeply troubled by this demand. He asked, "Am I to entrust you with him as I once entrusted you with his brother?" The old wound was still there, still painful, still shaping his decisions. But eventually, the grain they had brought ran out. The famine continued with no sign of ending. They needed to return to Egypt, but they couldn't return without Binyamin. The brothers pressed their father, promising they would protect Binyamin, swearing oaths that they would bring him back safely. Finally, reluctantly, with great fear and misgiving, Yaqub allowed Binyamin to go with them. But he made them swear before Allah that they would bring him back unless something completely beyond their control prevented it. When the brothers returned to Egypt with Binyamin, Yusuf saw his full brother for the first time in over 20 years. Binyamin had been an infant when Yusuf disappeared. Now he was a young man, and Yusuf's heart overflowed with emotion at seeing him. But he maintained his composure publicly, greeting all the brothers formally as the minister of Egypt greeting foreign grain buyers. He arranged for them all to be his guests, inviting them to dine with him. An honor that surprised them, but which they gratefully accepted. During the meal, he had them sit in pairs, and Binyamin found himself alone. Seeing Binyamin's sadness at having no partner, Yusuf said he would eat with him. He took Binyamin to a private room, and there, away from the others, he revealed his identity. Imagine Binyamin's shock. This powerful Egyptian minister, this man who controlled the food supply of the greatest nation on earth, was his lost brother Yusuf? The brother who had disappeared before he could even form memories of him. Binyamin looked at him carefully, seeing the features that resembled their father, seeing marks on his hand that family members would recognize, hearing details about their family that only Yusuf would know. Yusuf embraced his brother and explained everything. How their brothers had betrayed him, how he had been sold as a slave, how he had endured trials and tests, how Allah had eventually elevated him to this position. He told Binyamin not to reveal this to the others yet. There was a wisdom in waiting for the right moment. Binyamin, overwhelmed with joy and amazement, agreed to keep the secret. When they returned to the larger group, Yusuf ordered that their bags be filled with grain and provisions. But he also instructed his servants to hide his personal drinking cup, the royal cup, a precious item, in Binyamin's belongings without Binyamin's knowledge. This wasn't theft or deception for malicious purposes. Yusuf was implementing a plan to keep Binyamin with him in Egypt without revealing his identity yet, and without making the brothers immediately suspicious about his motives. The brothers prepared to leave with their provisions. They started their journey home, grateful for the minister's hospitality and relieved to have successfully completed their mission. But they hadn't gone far when they heard shouting behind them. Guards were pursuing them, calling for them to stop. The brothers were confused and alarmed. What was happening? The guards caught up to them and made an announcement. The royal cup was missing. The minister's precious cup had disappeared, and they were searching all the travelers who had been at the palace. The implication was clear. Someone had stolen it. The brothers were shocked and offended. They protested their innocence immediately. "We have not come to cause corruption in the land," they said, "and we are not thieves." The guards asked what the punishment should be if the cup was found in someone's belongings. The brothers, confident of their innocence and following the law they knew from Canaan, said that according to their custom, the person in whose bag it was found would be taken as compensation, essentially becoming a slave to pay for the theft. This was perfect for Yusuf's plan, though they didn't realize it. The guard began searching the bags, starting with the brothers' bags before Binyamin's to avoid immediate suspicion. They searched thoroughly, finding nothing. Finally, they came to Binyamin's bag, and there, to everyone's astonishment, was the royal cup. The brothers were stunned. How could this be? Binyamin wasn't a thief. They knew he hadn't stolen anything, but the evidence was undeniable. Yusuf's guards declared that according to the brothers' own stated principle, Binyamin must remain in Egypt as compensation for the theft. The brothers were devastated. They pleaded with the minister, explaining that their elderly father would be heartbroken, that he had only reluctantly allowed Binyamin to come, that they had sworn to protect him. They offered to leave one of themselves instead. Surely the minister would accept a substitute, an older and stronger man instead of this youth. But Yusuf, maintaining his role as the just Egyptian minister, refused. He said he could only hold the one in whose possession the cup was found. To hold someone else would be injustice. The law was clear, and by their own stated principle, Binyamin must remain. The brothers were trapped by their own words and by the apparent evidence. They had no choice but to accept this outcome, however painful. The older brothers prepared to return to Canaan without Binyamin, their hearts heavy with dread at how they would explain this to their father. One of them said he couldn't face their father and chose to remain in Egypt rather than go home with this news. But the others knew they had to return and report what had happened. They had sworn to bring Binyamin back, and now they had failed. When the brothers returned to Canaan without Binyamin and told their father what had happened, Yaqub's response revealed both his pain and his faith. He didn't believe their story entirely, just as he hadn't believed them years ago when they claimed a wolf had eaten Yusuf. He said, "Rather, your souls have enticed you to something. So patience is most fitting. Perhaps Allah will bring them both back to me. Indeed, He is the knowing, the wise." Notice the depth of that response. He said, "Bring them both back to me," meaning both Binyamin and Yusuf. Even after all these years, Yaqub still believed that Yusuf might be alive somewhere, still hoped for his return. His faith in Allah's plan never wavered even as his heart endured unimaginable pain. He turned away from his sons and wept, grieving for both his lost sons. His eyes, already weak from years of crying over Yusuf, grew worse. The sons, seeing their father's grief, said to him, "By Allah, you will not cease remembering Yusuf until you become fatally ill or become of those who perish." But Yaqub replied with words that show the nature of prophetic grief. "I only complain of my suffering and my grief to Allah, and I know from Allah that which you do not know." He wasn't complaining to his sons or to people. He was taking his pain to Allah alone. And he still had hope, still had knowledge that his sons didn't share, still trusted in divine wisdom even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He then told his sons to return to Egypt and search for Yusuf and Binyamin. "Don't give up hope in Allah's mercy," he instructed them. Go back and inquire about your brothers. Perhaps there is news. Perhaps there is hope." The brothers, moved by their father's faith and pain, agreed to return to Egypt once more. When the brothers returned to Egypt and came before Yusuf again, their circumstances had changed dramatically. They were humbler now, chastened by events, concerned for their father who was suffering so much. They approached the minister and explained their dire situation. They told him about their elderly father's grief, about how he had lost one son years ago and was now separated from another, about how the famine had left them with little to offer in payment for grain. They appealed to his mercy and generosity, asking if he would accept whatever humble payment they could offer and perhaps allow them to see their brother Binyamin. There was a desperation in their plea, a genuine humility that showed how much they had been changed by their experiences. These were not the same arrogant young men who had thrown their brother into a well decades ago. Life had humbled them, consequences had taught them, and suffering had opened their hearts. Yusuf looked at them and made his decision. The time for concealment was over. The test had achieved its purpose. His brothers had been humbled and had shown genuine concern for their father and their younger brother. Allah's plan had brought them to this moment through a path none of them could have anticipated. Yusuf asked them a question. "Do you know what you did with Yusuf and his brother when you were ignorant?" The brothers were startled by this question from the Egyptian minister. How did he know about Yusuf? Then the full realization began to dawn. Could it be? Was it possible? They asked, hardly daring to believe, "Are you indeed Yusuf?" And Yusuf answered, "I am Yusuf, and this is my brother. Allah has certainly favored us. Indeed, he who fears Allah and is patient, then indeed, Allah does not allow to be lost the reward of those who do good." Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the flood of emotions in that moment. The powerful minister before whom they had been bowing, who controlled their access to food, who held their brother and their fate in his hands, was Yusuf, the brother they had betrayed so long ago. Everything suddenly made sense. The insistence on seeing Binyamin, the special treatment, the tests and circumstances, all of it had been orchestrated by the brother they thought they had permanently removed from their lives. The brothers fell into immediate remorse and confession. "By Allah," they said, "certainly has Allah preferred you over us, and indeed, we have been sinners." They didn't make excuses or try to minimize what they had done. They acknowledged their sin directly, admitted that Allah had elevated Yusuf above them, recognized that they deserved blame for their past actions. And Yusuf's response reveals the beauty of his character, refined through years of trials. He said, "No blame will there be upon you today. Allah will forgive you, and He is the most merciful of the merciful." He forgave them completely. No conditions, no holding grudges, no desire for revenge. He had the power to punish them now. He could have had them imprisoned or executed for what they did. He could have at minimum humiliated them publicly or held their crime over them. But he chose mercy, chose forgiveness, chose to attribute his suffering to Allah's wisdom rather than to their evil. He gave them his shirt. Some narrations say this was a special shirt from his ancestor Ibrahim that had miraculous properties, and told them to take it to their father and place it over his face. It would restore his sight, Yusuf explained. Then they should bring the entire family to Egypt. The reunion would be complete. The family would be together again. The years of separation would end, and they would all be reunited in the land where Yusuf now held power. The brothers rushed back to Canaan with this unbelievable news. When they were still approaching, before they even arrived, Yaqub said to those around him, "Indeed, I find the smell of Yusuf. Do you think me senile?" Those around him, unable to smell anything, thought his grief had affected his mind. But when the brothers arrived and placed Yusuf's shirt over their father's face, his sight returned immediately. Yaqub said, "Did I not tell you that I know from Allah that which you do not know?" The brothers confessed to their father, asking him to seek forgiveness for them. "O our father, ask forgiveness for us of our sins. Indeed, we have been sinners." And Yaqub, displaying the mercy characteristic of prophets, promised to seek forgiveness for them from Allah, the most forgiving, the most merciful. Then the entire family prepared for the journey to Egypt. Prophet Yaqub, all his sons, their families, servants, and possessions. It was a major migration, moving from Canaan to Egypt, from the land of their ancestors to this foreign nation, where Yusuf now resided in power. When they arrived in Egypt, Yusuf came out to meet them with great honor. He brought his father and mother. Some scholars say this refers to his maternal aunt who had raised him, as his biological mother had passed away when he was young, and seated them in positions of honor. Then, in fulfillment of the dream he had seen as a young boy so many years ago, his parents and his 11 brothers prostrated before him in honor and respect. It wasn't worship. Prostration to anyone other than Allah was permitted in previous religious laws as a sign of respect, though it's strictly forbidden in Islamic law. They bowed before him in recognition of his position, his wisdom, and Allah's favor upon him. Yusuf turned to his father and said words preserved in the Quran. "O my father, this is the interpretation of my vision of before. My Lord has made it reality. And he was certainly good to me when he took me out of prison and brought you here from the desert after Satan had induced discord between me and my brothers. Indeed, my Lord is subtle in what he wills. Indeed, it is he who is the knowing, the wise." Notice what he emphasized. He didn't say, "when he saved me from the well," or "when he rescued me from slavery." He said, "when he took me out of prison." That was the turning point, the moment when his elevation truly began. And he attributed the brothers' actions to Satan's influence, not to their inherent evil. He focused on Allah's kindness in bringing his family to Egypt, in reuniting them after such long separation. He recognized that Allah had been subtly guiding events all along, even when the path seemed dark and the purpose unclear. The king of Egypt, hearing that his minister's family had arrived, came to meet them. He was greatly impressed by Prophet Yaqub, by the light of prophethood evident in his face, by his noble bearing despite his advanced age. The king embraced Islam after meeting Yaqub, recognizing the truth when he encountered it. Many of his courtiers followed his example, and the faith spread through the upper levels of Egyptian society. Yusuf settled his family in Egypt with honor. They were given good lands to live on, provisions for their needs, and respect as the family of the powerful minister. The children of Israel, Yaqub's descendants, would remain in Egypt for generations, eventually numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But that's a story for another time. The story of their eventual exodus under Prophet Musa, peace be upon him, centuries later. The story of Yusuf from prison to palace is filled with profound lessons that remain relevant for every generation. Let's reflect on some of the timeless wisdom this narrative contains. First, there's a lesson of patience in the face of injustice. Yusuf was wrongly imprisoned for years. He had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Yet he didn't become bitter, didn't stop worshiping Allah, didn't let injustice corrupt his character. He understood that our response to unfair treatment is a test of who we truly are. It's easy to be righteous when things are going well. The real test is maintaining righteousness when everything seems to be going wrong. Many of us face smaller injustices in our lives, being overlooked for a promotion we deserved, being falsely accused of things we didn't do, suffering consequences for other people's mistakes. Yusuf's example teaches us that patient endurance isn't passive resignation. It's active faith that continues doing good, continues serving others, continues trusting Allah even when circumstances seem to contradict his justice. Second, there's the lesson about the purpose of trials. Yusuf's imprisonment wasn't wasted time. It was preparation. It put him in position to meet the cupbearer. It gave him time to develop patience and deep reliance on Allah. It humbled him in ways that made him a better leader later. Sometimes what looks like a detour is actually the path. Sometimes what feels like a setback is actually set up for something greater. If Allah had freed Yusuf immediately after Zuleikha's false accusation, he might have been vindicated, but he wouldn't have had the opportunity to interpret the king's dream. He wouldn't have been positioned to save millions from starvation. The prison years, painful as they were were part of a larger plan that Yusuf couldn't see while he was living through them, but which became clear in hindsight. When we face difficulties, we should ask not just, why is this happening to me? But, what is this preparing me for? Every trial is developing something in us. Patience, compassion, wisdom, strength that we'll need for future responsibilities we can't yet imagine. Third, there's a profound lesson about forgiveness. When Yusuf finally had power over his brothers, he chose mercy. He didn't repay evil with evil. He didn't hold grudges or seek revenge. He recognized that clinging to past hurts would poison his own heart and accomplish nothing good. His forgiveness was complete and genuine, not reluctant or conditional. This teaches us something vital about freedom. Unforgiveness keeps us chained to our past, to people who hurt us, to events that are over. When we forgive, we're not saying what happened was okay. We're saying we're not going to let it control our present and future anymore. We're releasing ourselves from the prison of bitterness. Yusuf's forgiveness was actually an act of power, not weakness. It showed he was free from the need for revenge, free from being defined by what was done to him. Fourth, there's the lesson about divine timing and wisdom. Everything in Yusuf's story happened at exactly the right time, though it often didn't seem that way while it was happening. The brothers threw him in the well at just the right time for the traveling caravan to find him. He was sold as a slave at just the right age to grow up in the minister's household. He was imprisoned at just the time that would eventually lead to meeting the cupbearer. The king had his dream at exactly the moment when Yusuf had been in prison long enough but was ready to emerge. Allah's timing is perfect even when it doesn't match our preferences. We want things now, want relief immediately, want our prayers answered on our schedule. But Allah sees the whole picture while we see only the present moment. He knows what's coming, what we're being prepared for, when we're truly ready for what we're asking for. Learning to trust divine timing is a mark of mature faith. Fifth, there's a lesson about using our gifts in service of others. Yusuf had a remarkable gift of dream interpretation, but he didn't use it for personal gain or to impress people. He used it to help the two prisoners, even making sure to guide them to faith before interpreting their dreams. He used it to save an entire nation from famine. His gifts were tools for service, not toys for ego. Each of us has gifts, skills, knowledge, resources, opportunities. The question is how we use them. Are they for self-aggrandizement or for serving others? Are they hoarded or shared? Yusuf shows us that our gifts are trusts from Allah, meant to be used for good in the world, to ease suffering, to bring benefit to Allah's creation. Sixth, there's a lesson about leadership and governance. When Yusuf was given authority, he didn't abuse it. He didn't use his position to enrich himself or settle scores. He worked tirelessly for the welfare of people he had no tribal or familial connection to. He made difficult decisions that weren't popular but were necessary. He combined compassion with firmness, mercy with justice. This is a model for anyone in any position of authority, whether leading a nation, managing a business, running a household, or supervising a team. Leadership is a trust, not a privilege. It's about serving those under your care, making decisions for their benefit even when those decisions are hard, being willing to be temporarily unpopular to do what's right. Seventh, there's a lesson about maintaining integrity regardless of circumstances. Yusuf was righteous as a slave, as a prisoner, and as a minister. His character didn't change based on his situation. He didn't say, "I'll be moral when I have power, but right now I need to compromise to survive." His principles weren't negotiable, weren't dependent on whether he was up or down in the world. This consistency is rare and precious. Many people are good when being good is easy or rewarding, but compromise their principles when the pressure is on. Yusuf shows us that true character is what you maintain when no one is watching, when there's no obvious benefit to righteousness, when doing wrong would be easy and doing right is hard. Eighth, there's a profound lesson about turning to Allah in every situation. When Zuleikha tried to seduce him, Yusuf prayed for Allah's protection. When he was imprisoned unjustly, he continued worshiping. When he had the opportunity to use his gift, he attributed it to Allah's teaching. When he gained power, he acknowledged it as Allah's favor. In ease and difficulty, in weakness and strength, he remained connected to his Creator. This constant turning to Allah, this maintaining of the vertical relationship with the divine, even as horizontal relationships with people rise and fall, is the heart of faith. Allah is the constant while everything else changes. When we anchor ourselves to Him, the storms of life can shake us but not destroy us. Ninth, there's a lesson about the eventual triumph of truth. Yusuf's innocence was eventually established. His character was eventually recognized. His righteousness was eventually rewarded. It took years, and the path was painful, but the truth came out in the end. This doesn't mean everything always works out perfectly in this life. Sometimes vindication comes only in the next life. But it means that truth has power, that righteousness has weight, that what is real eventually manifests. When we face false accusations or misunderstandings, we can take comfort in knowing that Allah sees, knows, and will eventually set the record straight. We don't have to defend ourselves constantly or frantically try to change people's perceptions. We can patiently maintain our integrity and trust that truth will eventually shine through. 10th, there's a lesson about family reconciliation. Despite everything his brothers did to him, Yusuf worked to bring the family back together. He didn't say, "Those people hurt me. I'm done with them forever." He understood that family relationships, though tested and broken, can be healed when people are willing to forgive, when wrongdoers are willing to repent, when everyone chooses mercy over vengeance. This doesn't mean accepting ongoing abuse or pretending nothing happened. But it does mean leaving the door open for genuine reconciliation when those who wronged us show real change. It means not letting past hurts permanently destroy relationships that could potentially be restored. Yusuf's reunion with his family brought joy to his elderly father and allowed the entire family to benefit from Allah's blessings. Unforgiveness would have denied them all that blessing. These lessons aren't just historical curiosities. They speak powerfully to our modern context. Think about how many people today feel stuck in situations they didn't choose and can't immediately change. Bad jobs, difficult relationships, health challenges, financial struggles. Yusuf's story reminds us that being stuck doesn't mean being abandoned by Allah. Those years in prison weren't wasted. They were investment in his future leadership. Think about how many people struggle with forgiveness in an age of social media where grievances are broadcasted and held onto forever, where cancel culture means people's mistakes follow them endlessly. Yusuf shows us a different way. Acknowledging wrong, yes, but also extending mercy, allowing for change and growth, not defining people forever by their worst moments. Think about how many people in positions of authority abuse their power in ways large and small. Yusuf demonstrates that leadership is service, that authority is responsibility, that power should be used to benefit others rather than exploit them. In a world plagued by corruption at every level, his integrity shines as both an example and a rebuke. Think about how many people feel their gifts and talents are being wasted, unrecognized, underutilized. Yusuf spent years in circumstances where his abilities seemed irrelevant. But Allah was preparing him and positioning him for the moment when those gifts would be needed. Our season of obscurity may be preparation for a season of influence we can't yet see coming. Think about how much emphasis modern culture places on immediate gratification, on getting what we want right now, on refusing to accept any delay or difficulty. Yusuf's story is an extended meditation on patience, not passive waiting, but active faith that continues doing good while trusting Allah's timing. It challenges our demand for instant results and asks us to take a longer view. Think about how many families are fractured by old hurts, ancient grievances, things said and done years ago that people won't let go of. Yusuf shows that reconciliation is possible, that families can heal, that it's worth working toward reunion rather than resignation to permanent estrangement. His brothers did something terrible, but decades later they were together again, and that reunion brought blessings to everyone involved. The story also speaks to the experience of refugees and immigrants, people forced from their homes, taken to strange lands, having to adapt to foreign cultures and languages. Yusuf was forcibly removed from his home, sold in a strange land, had to learn Egyptian language and customs. Yet, he maintained his faith, his identity, his values even while adapting to his new environment. He shows how it's possible to integrate into a new society without losing your core self, to serve a nation not your own without betraying your principles. It speaks to those who have been falsely accused or unfairly punished. In an age of miscarriages of justice, of people imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, of reputations destroyed by lies, Yusuf's insistence on establishing his innocence before accepting freedom provides a model. Don't just escape from injustice. Work to overturn it. Don't just survive false accusations. Establish the truth. Your vindication matters not just for you, but for truth itself. The story speaks to anyone working in systems they don't entirely agree with, trying to do good within imperfect institutions. Yusuf served a polytheistic king in a pagan society, yet he didn't compromise his monotheism or his principles. He worked within the system to save lives, to establish justice where he could, to influence society toward good. Sometimes the choice isn't between a perfect option and an imperfect one. It's between doing some good in an imperfect system or doing nothing at all. It speaks to those dealing with the consequences of other people's sins and mistakes. Yusuf suffered for years because of what his brothers did, what Zuleikha did, what the cupbearer failed to do. Yet, he didn't let other people's failures become his excuse for bitterness or inaction. We're all affected by other people's choices. Parents' mistakes, siblings' betrayals, colleagues' incompetence, leaders' corruption. Yusuf shows that we can't control what others do, but we can control who we become in response. The story speaks profoundly to our understanding of Allah's attributes and how He works in the world. We see His mercy in protecting Yusuf through every trial, His wisdom in orchestrating events to work together for ultimate good, His justice in eventually vindicating the innocent and bringing truth to light, His power in elevating someone from the depths of a prison to the heights of governance, His subtlety in guiding events through natural means rather than constant obvious miracles. Allah could have supernaturally freed Yusuf from prison at any moment. He could have struck the false accusers dead or confused the prison guards or sent angels to break the chains. But instead, He worked through dreams and human interactions, through a cupbearer's memory and a king's need for interpretation. The supernatural intervention came not in the form of dramatic miracles, but in the form of prophetic knowledge and divine providence guiding natural events. This teaches us to look for Allah's work in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary, to recognize His hand in what might seem like mere coincidence or good fortune. Yusuf lived for many more years after this reunion, serving Egypt faithfully and calling people to the worship of one God. Historical reports vary on the exact length of his life. Some say he lived to 110 years, others say 120. But all agree that he lived long enough to see his father Yaqub pass away and to witness his family grow and prosper in Egypt. When Prophet Yaqub died, he was buried according to his wishes in the land of his forefathers. The family eventually became numerous in Egypt, growing from a single extended family to what would become an entire nation, the children of Israel. But that growth and the challenges that would follow it belong to later chapters of prophetic history. As for Yusuf himself, when his death approached, he gave instructions to his people. He told them that a time would come when a tyrannical pharaoh would rule Egypt and oppress their descendants. He predicted that eventually a prophet would arise from among them who would lead them out of Egypt. When that exodus happened, Yusuf instructed them to take his remains with them and bury him in the land of his forefathers, alongside the earlier prophets of his line. Centuries later, when Prophet Musa led the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, they honored Yusuf's request. They carried his preserved remains with them on that momentous journey, ensuring that the prophet, who had saved Egypt from starvation, would rest in the land of his ancestors rather than the land he had served so faithfully. The legacy of Yusuf extends far beyond his lifetime. His story has been told and retold for thousands of years, inspiring countless people to patience in difficulty, to integrity in temptation, to forgiveness after betrayal, to service in authority. The Quran calls it the best of stories not because it has the most dramatic action or the most surprising plot twists, but because it contains such concentrated wisdom about the human condition and about Allah's relationship with his servants. As we conclude this journey from prison to palace, from the depths of injustice to the heights of honorable authority, we're left with a profound sense of how Allah guides those who trust in him. Yusuf's life wasn't easy. In fact, it was filled with trials that would have broken most people. Betrayal by family, slavery, false accusations, years of imprisonment. Any one of these would be enough to embitter someone permanently. Yet Yusuf emerged from all of it with his faith intact, his character refined, his purpose clear. The title Best of Stories, which Allah himself gave to this narrative, takes on deeper meaning as we reflect on its lessons. It's the best because it shows us how to maintain faith when circumstances seem to contradict divine justice. It's the best because it demonstrates how apparent disasters can be hidden blessings. It's the best because it illustrates how patience and integrity eventually bear fruit. It's the best because it teaches both the powerful and the powerless, both the wronged and the forgiven. If you're in a prison of your own today, whether literal or metaphorical, whether physical walls or circumstances that confine you, remember Yusuf. Your prison is not your destination. It's part of your journey. The years that seem wasted may be preparing you for responsibilities you can't yet imagine. The injustice you're enduring is not escaping Allah's notice. The dreams and hopes that seem impossible may be prophecies of a future Allah is already preparing. If you've been betrayed by those who should have protected you, remember how Yusuf forgave his brothers. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the wrong didn't happen. It means refusing to let it poison your future. It means releasing yourself from the prison of bitterness even if you can't change what happened. It means trusting Allah to balance the scales of justice rather than taking that burden on yourself. If you've been blessed with any form of power or authority, in your workplace, your community, your family, remember how Yusuf used his position. Authority is a trust, not a trophy. It's about service, not supremacy. The question isn't, what can I get from this position? But what good can I do with this responsibility? Every position of influence, no matter how small, is an opportunity to reflect Allah's attributes of justice, mercy, and compassion in how we treat those under our care. If you're waiting for vindication, for truth to be established, for your character to be recognized, remember that Yusuf waited years, but the truth eventually came out. Continue doing what's right even when no one seems to notice. Maintain your integrity even when cutting corners would be easier. Trust that Allah sees even what people miss, and that He will honor those who honor Him, whether in this life or the next. If you're struggling with family relationships damaged by past hurts, remember that reconciliation is possible. It requires humility from those who did wrong and mercy from those who were wronged. It requires everyone to value the relationship more than the ego, to want healing more than vindication. Yusuf and his brothers show us that even the deepest wounds can heal when people are willing to forgive, to repent, and to start fresh. The story of Yusuf from prison to palace is ultimately a story about Allah's faithful care for His servants. It's about how He never abandons those who trust in Him, even when they can't see His hand at work. It's about how He can turn any situation around, can bring light from darkness, can extract blessing from hardship. It's about how His plans are always unfolding, even when we're confused about where we are or where we're going. So whatever prison you find yourself in today, know that it's not the end of your story. Keep worshiping, keep serving, keep trusting. Maintain your character when it would be easy to compromise. Choose patience when you want to despair. Extend forgiveness when you'd rather hold grudges. Use whatever gifts and opportunities you have to benefit others. And trust that the one who took Yusuf from a dark prison to the heights of honorable authority can guide your journey too, in ways you cannot yet imagine. The palace is not guaranteed in this life. Sometimes Allah's elevation of His servants happens in the next world, rather than this one. But the spiritual reality that Yusuf embodied, the patience, the integrity, the trust in Allah, the service to others, that's available to everyone regardless of their circumstances. And that internal palace, that fortress of faith that no prison can confine and no injustice can destroy, is actually more valuable than any worldly position. May Allah grant us the patience of Yusuf in our trials, the integrity of Yusuf in our temptations, the forgiveness of Yusuf toward those who wrong us, and the wisdom of Yusuf in whatever positions of responsibility he grants us. May he help us see his hand at work in our lives, even when the path is dark and the destination unclear. May he make us people who respond to hardship with faith rather than bitterness, who use whatever blessings we receive to serve rather than to dominate, who trust his timing even when it doesn't match our preferences. The story of Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, is a gift to every generation. It speaks to every heart that has known pain, every soul that has endured injustice, every person who has wondered if their situation will ever change. It whispers hope into our darkness and reminds us that with Allah, the impossible becomes possible, the forgotten become remembered, and those in prisons find their way to palaces. If not in this world, then certainly in the next. If you found benefit in this journey through one of the most beloved stories in all of Scripture, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear Yusuf's story today. Someone facing their own trials, someone struggling to forgive, someone wondering if their patience will ever be rewarded. The prophetic stories aren't just history. They're ongoing guidance for every soul seeking to navigate the complexities of human existence while maintaining faith in divine wisdom. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon Prophet Yusuf, upon his father Prophet Yaqub, upon all the prophets and messengers who came before and after them, and may Allah's guidance reach us through their examples. May we learn from their lives, be inspired by their faith, and follow their path of trust in Allah through all circumstances. And may we be reunited with them in the eternal palace of paradise, where no prison walls exist and no injustice occurs, where patience is rewarded and faith is vindicated, where all the trials of this temporary world are revealed to have been worthwhile preparations for an eternal home. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the hope and wisdom found in the best of stories.